A flight attendant disrespected a black CEO for asking for food. But what the CEO did next was captured by 3 phones, leaving the entire cabin stunned. A flight attendant spat on a black CEO's face for simply asking for food, thinking no one would notice. He didn't realize every reaction was being recorded from 3 angles. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when truth is caught in motion. The boarding bridge echoed with the soft tap of leather shoes as Dr. Kalen Maris stepped onto Arian Air Flight 417. His briefcase in one hand, his 10-year-old son's fingers gripped in the other. The air inside the aircraft was cool and filtered, but something sharper drifted beneath the surface. An unspoken tension that prickled along the edge of Kalen's awareness the moment he entered the first-class cabin. Without hesitation, his eyes scanned the layout. He caught it instantly. 2 male flight attendants near the galley stiffened at his presence. One of them leaned close to whisper something to the other, both casting sidelong glances toward him. Kalen didn't need to hear the words. Their posture spoke volumes. He said nothing, adjusting his hold on the sleek briefcase that carried the encrypted drive, contents too valuable to even mention aloud. The entire merger hinged on the data inside. Yet he wasn't nervous. He was trained for this. Anticipation, pattern recognition, quiet reads of body language that had become second nature long before he'd become the CEO of Virilon Systems. Seat 1 gleamed ahead, bathed in soft blue light from the cabin overhead. He guided Jaren forward, offering a warm, fatherly nod that settled the boy's energy. Jaren clutched his tablet, nervous, though he tried to mask it with curiosity. Kalen admired his effort. "We're almost there," he said quietly, smoothing the boy's collar. The boy nodded, eyes scanning the window. A male flight attendant stepped forward, tall, clean-shaven, a name tag reading Brillen Voss clipped to his chest. But the moment their eyes met, Kalen registered the freeze in Brillen's smile. It wasn't hesitation. It was calculation. Brillen took the boarding pass with slow fingers, scanning it with more scrutiny than necessary. "Seat 1A, Kalen said evenly. Brillen didn't respond immediately. He simply gestured toward the seat with a forced tilt of the head, lips pursed. Kalen offered a courteous thank you, but Brillen's frown only deepened. The other passengers in first class remained unaware, absorbed in their own worlds of newspapers, earbuds, and last-minute messages. But Kalen felt it, a current shifting beneath still water. He settled into the seat, lowering the briefcase gently to the floor. With careful precision, he slid the encrypted drive beneath the seat cushion, secure but accessible. Across the aisle, Brillen lingered longer than needed, pretending to adjust a supply cart. His gaze never fully left Kalen. Jaren fidgeted beside him, navigating through his tablet's menus with trembling fingers. Kalen gently steadied the screen and whispered, "Watch your posture. Eyes forward, like we practiced." The boy relaxed. Outside, the engine hum crescendoed. Inside, Kalen's mind moved even faster. He glanced toward Brillen again, just in time to catch the attendant muttering under his breath. The words weren't meant to be heard, but Kalen heard them anyway. "Let's see how this one behaves." He didn't flinch. He didn't respond. But in that single moment, everything fell into place. Brillen wasn't improvising, he had an agenda. Kalen's instincts weren't just alert now. They were locked into place. A threat had been identified. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't change expression. But beneath his controlled exterior, the strategist had already begun laying the groundwork. The calm face of a man who had prepared for scenarios no one else could see. Because this wasn't just a flight anymore. It was a test, a challenge. And Brillen had no idea who he had just chosen to challenge. Nothing was ordinary on this flight, and every second counted for what was about to unfold. Brillen Voss spat in Kalen's face. It happened in a flash, but with all the slow, sickening clarity of a gunshot in a silent room. The thick glob of contempt landed just below Kalen's right eye, sliding down the clean line of his cheekbone. A warm insult carried on the sour breath of aggression. Around them, first-class passengers froze in mid-sip, mid-scroll, mid-thought. The hush that followed was total. Startled inhalations caught in throats, fingers stiffened on screens, heads snapping sideways in disbelief. Even the hum of the aircraft felt muted under the weight of what had just occurred. Jaren flinched, confused and alarmed. His small hands tightened their grip around the armrest, and his wide brown eyes darted between his father's face and the man standing above them. Kalen did not flinch. His face remained still, the muscles tight with deliberate control. The only movement was his left hand, which slowly came up, not to wipe away the spit, but to gently press a reassuring touch on Jaren's knee. Brillin stood tall, tray in hand, lips curled into a triumphant sneer, as if he had just bested a rival in some imagined power struggle. "Guess that chicken's off the menu," he muttered, not quite under his breath. Kalen exhaled, long and quiet. His heart pounded, but his expression remained unreadable. Underneath his cuff, a discreet double tap to the face of his smartwatch activated a silent command. Record, store, stream. The camera embedded in the watch's bezel captured Brillin's every move, and a live feed began streaming to Virulon's system's internal compliance server. The feed would be geotagged, time-stamped, and stored redundantly in 3 private clouds. "Jaren," Kalen said softly, his voice low and calm, "focus on your tablet. Watch the science video." Jaren nodded, his voice caught in his throat, but his trust was absolute. He adjusted his headphones and turned his eyes back to the screen, though his body remained tense. Kalen turned his gaze upward. His eyes locked on Brillin with the cool intensity of a man accustomed to hostile boardrooms, high-stakes negotiations, and calculated warfare carried out through clauses and silence. "This is a formal flight," Kalen said in an even tone. "You are required to treat passengers with basic decency." Brillin chuckled and leaned down, closer now, his breath sour with coffee and malice. "People like you think that suit makes you untouchable," he whispered. "Let's see how much that smirk holds up midair." The line was meant to provoke. Kalen knew it instantly, and yet he said nothing. No raised voice. No threats. Instead, he adjusted his seatbelt slightly, shifting the smartwatch to catch a better angle. He knew the value of silence, especially when the world was watching. From the side, a middle-aged man 2 seats down hesitated, his phone in his hand but not yet recording. His eyes flicked between the men. Another passenger on the opposite aisle gently set her phone to her lap, camera lens angled toward the confrontation. Kalen noted both moves, but didn't acknowledge them. Brillin gave one final smirk before stepping back, tray clinking slightly as it hit the cart behind him. The silence in the cabin remained tense, a quiet before something no one could yet name. A few seats back, a young man cleared his throat nervously. No one else moved. Kalen reached for the napkin Brillin had left on the tray and slowly wiped the spit from his face with a single, deliberate motion. Then he folded it, set it aside like evidence, and looked straight ahead. Inside, his mind was running at full speed. He'd read Brillin within moments of boarding, overconfident posture, insecure dominance, eyes that hunted approval from his peers. This wasn't a spontaneous act. It was premeditated contempt. Kalen had faced men like him before, not in flight uniforms but in conference rooms, in mergers, in sabotage attempts masked as business decisions. And those men never anticipated what came next when their arrogance outpaced their intellect. He turned to Jaren again and whispered, "We're going to stay calm, all right? This is a learning moment." Jaren blinked slowly, trusting but confused. Brillin had moved on or pretended to. He served other passengers with exaggerated politeness, offering extra napkins and refilled drinks, all while sneaking glances back toward Kalen's seat. His shoulders betrayed him, tense, expectant, waiting for retaliation. But none came, not yet. Kalen's fingers tapped another command into the smartwatch, an encrypted security alert. It was coded, silent, sent directly to Virulon's internal risk monitoring team. Its title, Level 2, Active Hostility, Live Flight Standby. It didn't name the aggressor. It didn't need to. What Brillin didn't know was that Kalen had preloaded contingency protocols into his wearable for this exact kind of scenario. With a single tap, the system had already tagged the incident for internal review. If anything escalated, the next stage would be legal activation, full evidence compilation, affidavit formatting, and federal compliance auto-notification on touchdown. Across the cabin, a tall man in business casual glanced over again. Kalen met his eyes for a second. The man gave the faintest of nods. Another observer. Possibly another recording. The mood of the cabin had shifted. Some passengers had noticed. Others tried to pretend they hadn't. But no one had missed what had happened. And no one could unsee it now. Dramatic irony pulsed beneath the surface. Brillin believed he had made a bold power move. An open display of disrespect that would humiliate his target. But what he didn't understand was that his victim had spent his life preparing for attacks that looked like favors and threats that came wrapped in smiles. This was nothing new. Kalen didn't need to retaliate with rage. He only needed to wait. Because everything Brillin had just done, every sneer, every word, every drop of spit, had already been captured from 3 angles. And the one man he'd tried to humiliate was already turning the cabin into a courtroom. Every eye on him was about to witness a calculated response no one expected. Brillin Voss returned with a deliberate intensity in his stride. His posture sharpened by a twisted sense of superiority. He loomed just over Kalen Maris's shoulder, the cabin lights catching the faint glint of a polished name badge that did little to reflect professionalism. Without a word, Brillin leaned in, closing the already narrow distance between them with a breath too close and eyes too intent. He hovered like a predator waiting for flinch, craving the satisfaction of a visible reaction. But Kalen gave him none. With a subtle tap beneath his sleeve, Kalen activated the recording function embedded in his smartwatch. A quiet vibration confirmed the stream was live, beaming directly to a secure app monitored by his company's internal security team. In a parallel motion, he slid his heel just under the briefcase beneath his seat, gently pushing it back a few inches toward the centerline where it would be less exposed. The encrypted drive inside was worth more than most passengers on this flight would ever guess. Not just data, but leverage in an impending acquisition that could redefine the cybersecurity market. And yet, at this moment, the real threat wasn't corporate theft. It was the unpredictable hostility from the uniformed man standing inches away. Brillin let out a low, mocking laugh, his lips barely moving. "I don't answer to threats disguised as politeness," he said, the words sharp and laced with contempt. His eyes flicked briefly toward Jaren, then back at Kalen, as though to gauge if the child's presence softened the father's edge. Jaren gripped the armrest tightly, his knuckles pale, silently pressing himself into the leather seat as though trying to vanish into its seams. Kalen turned slightly, enough to shield his son without drawing attention. His voice remained steady. "Please remain professional. My son and I are your responsibility during this flight." The sentence was quiet, almost gentle, but every word landed with precision. It wasn't a plea. It was a warning wrapped in civility. Brillin's smirk wavered for a moment before he reached toward the drink tray on the armrest, knocking it slightly off-center. A loud clink broke the ambient hum of the cabin. Some passengers looked up. Others avoided eye contact, aware now that something unspoken was building between seat 1A and the man in uniform. Kalen's heart rate remained steady, but his mind moved like a machine under pressure. The camera embedded in his smartwatch had already logged over 4 minutes of visual and audio evidence. He tapped once more beneath the armrest, flipping a concealed latch. A small port opened, just wide enough to slide in a capsule no bigger than a matchbox. Inside it, another encrypted storage chip began copying footage directly from the watch in real time. Redundancy was protocol. Exposure was the plan. "Dad." Jaren's voice was barely a whisper, his eyes brimming with confusion and fear. "What do we do?" Kalen turned his head only slightly, just enough for Jaren to see the calm in his father's eyes. "Stay calm," he said quietly. "Just keep watching the screen." The tablet in front of Jaren still played a muted educational documentary, its flickering glow reflecting off the window. But the real lesson was happening in silence. Brillin stepped back, arms crossed now, as if satisfied that he had left a mark, even if invisible. He muttered something under his breath and turned away, moving down the aisle with a stiffness that betrayed his frustration. Across the cabin, a passenger in seat 2C adjusted his phone, pretending to scroll through photos but actually angling his camera just enough to capture the scene at the front. Another passenger behind Jaren glanced up and then down again, thumbing the record button without a word. Brillin didn't see them. He was too consumed by his own performance. Kalen leaned back, eyes scanning the nearby passengers, noting each one who looked nervous, alert, or quietly supportive. These were not random bystanders, they were potential witnesses, and he cataloged each one like a chess player marking the board. Every face had become a possible ally or future affidavit. He adjusted the briefcase once more with his foot, sliding it against the floor rail, hidden but secure. Its presence was a silent vow. This wasn't just about dignity, it was about protecting something far larger. The flight attendant's overconfidence was his greatest weakness. Brillin believed he was intimidating a man who wouldn't fight back. But Kalen had already set the pieces in motion. 1 camera, 2 angles, live stream, redundant storage, security team on standby. Even the smallest twitch in Brillin's jaw had been captured in high definition. The flight's gentle hum returned, blending with the occasional rattle of cutlery and muffled conversations. But for Kalen, every sound was a marker. Every footstep Brillin took was a countdown. Every glance from another crew member confirmed the pressure building behind the curtain of civility. He closed his eyes for a breath, replaying the scene mentally, committing it to memory not as a victim, but as an analyst. There would be no physical reaction, no raised voice, no escalation. This was strategy, not survival. And when he opened his eyes again, the calm in them wasn't for show. The calmest man in first class had already begun orchestrating his quiet but decisive counterattack. Brillin's hand shot forward and seized Kalen's forearm with a sharp jerk, his fingers pressing in with unnecessary force. The motion was sudden, public, and unmistakably aggressive. A chorus of gasps rippled through the first-class cabin, and a few passengers instinctively raised their phones, fumbling to unlock cameras. The click of recording buttons and the shuffling of seats followed as tension surged like an electric current through the rows. Brillin's face hovered inches from Kalen's, lips curled in a smirk that didn't match the supposed role of an attendant. He wanted a reaction, a snap, a shout, anything that would make the CEO look volatile. But the reaction he got was silence. Calm, cold, unnerving silence. Kalen didn't flinch. Instead, he exhaled slowly, calculating. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, flicked down to the point of contact, then returned to Brillin's. The CEO's expression held no fear, only the quiet awareness of a man who had seen traps before and knew exactly how to dismantle them. His right hand moved in a fluid, almost imperceptible arc, not to resist, but to guide Brillin's grip sideways, redirecting it toward the outside of his armrest where the motion appeared passive, even accidental. In doing so, he ensured the nearby cabin cameras and his smartwatch had a perfect, undisrupted view of the interaction. Jaren's knuckles whitened as he clung to the seat in front, small shoulders tight with fear. His eyes were locked on his father, confusion swimming behind his stare. But Kalen turned his head slightly and whispered, "Stay calm, watch and learn." His voice was soft, yet anchored with certainty. The boy nodded, drawing in a breath as if clinging to his father's strength. Then Kalen made his next move not against Brillin, but against the clock. He slid his elbow subtly toward the inside of the armrest and tapped a near-invisible switch beneath the padded leather. With a quiet mechanical click, a recessed compartment hissed open just wide enough to reveal a secure, compact device lined with blinking blue lights, the portable evidence module. It immediately began syncing with his watch, cross-referencing angles, capturing metadata, and backing up encrypted video to his legal team's server via a private satellite stream. The entire encounter, from the spit to the grip, was being preserved with crystal clarity. Brillin hadn't noticed. He was too caught up in the illusion of dominance. "Having trouble keeping your seat, sir?" Brillin asked sarcastically, squeezing Kalen's arm just a little tighter. Kalen met his gaze evenly. "Let go. You're making a mistake that won't disappear after landing." A beat passed. Brillin pulled his hand away abruptly, scoffing under his breath, but not before passengers in the third row began capturing over-the-shoulder footage. The cabin crew at the front hesitated, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. They exchanged muted glances. No one wanted to make the wrong move in front of phones. No one knew who to side with, not yet. Kalen scanned the cabin with the calm of a chess master 3 moves ahead. His eyes caught the man in seat 2C, mid-40s, graying hair, reading glasses and shirt pocket, who had been discreetly filming since the beginning of the confrontation. Kalen held his gaze just long enough, then gave the smallest nod, a silent cue. The man understood. He shifted his phone slightly, tilting it to capture a wider frame. "Is there a problem here?" one of the junior crew members finally asked, his voice uncertain. "No problem," Brillin snapped before Kalen could answer. His voice was louder now, performative. "Just making sure the passenger's comfortable." Then he turned, grabbed a tray from the side galley, and with a flourish, slammed it down on Kalen's armrest. The metal clattered loudly against the frame, startling Jaren. The force wasn't enough to injure, but it sent a clear signal of malice. Brillin didn't speak, didn't wait. He just turned and walked away with sharp, rigid strides. Kalen didn't move. His hands remained relaxed on his lap, but the evidence module glowed now, fully synced. He leaned forward slightly, shielding it from view, and let it retract back into its secure compartment with a soft click. Jaren turned to him, voice trembling. "Why doesn't he get in trouble for this?" Kalen gently placed a hand on his son's back. "Because some people think no one is watching. They forget that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the most prepared." The cabin remained tense, a strange mix of passengers pretending not to look and others staring openly. A few whispered among themselves, replaying what they'd just seen. Every movement had a purpose. Every second was proof. Kalen's restraint hadn't been weakness. It had been preparation. As Brillin disappeared into the galley, his footsteps loud with false confidence, Kalen adjusted his cuff and checked his watch. The timestamp was perfect. The footage was clean. The module had done its job. So had he. Each calculated second was building a record no one could deny. "This behavior will not continue. You are on notice." The words sliced through the cabin with quiet precision. Kalen Maris didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone alone carried the weight of authority, measured, deliberate, and impossible to dismiss. He sat completely upright in his seat, his spine straight as steel, his expression unreadable. The small flick of his wrist drew Brillin Voss's attention to the smartwatch on his arm, its screen faintly pulsing with an active recording display. The subtle gesture was enough. Brillin's smirk flickered, a fracture in his facade of control. He followed Kalen's glance and noticed, not just the watch, but the faint reflections of phones lifted across the cabin. 3, possibly more, now capturing every second from different angles. The air pressure in the cabin hadn't changed, but the atmosphere had grown much heavier. Brillin took a small step back, unconsciously, his body betraying hesitation even as his lips curled into defiance. Kalen's gaze remained fixed and calm, not threatening but absolute. His son, Jaren, sat frozen beside him, lips parted slightly, eyes shifting between his father and the man who had just spit in his face moments earlier. The boy didn't speak. He didn't have to. His small frame leaned just a bit toward Kalen, instinctively anchoring himself to the presence he trusted most. Kalen turned his head slightly and pressed the call button. The chime echoed like a gavel. A moment later, the senior flight attendant, a man named Corin Vale, approached, his expression already creased with concern. He looked between the two men, sensing the tension but not fully understanding it. "Sir?" Corin asked cautiously, his eyes flickering toward the other passengers now clearly watching. Kalen kept his voice even. "There's an escalating issue of misconduct involving a member of your staff. I'm documenting every moment. I recommend that you stay neutral and make no assumptions. But this situation is no longer containable unless it is addressed properly." Corin opened his mouth, hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Understood, sir. I'll inform the captain." But Kalen wasn't finished. As Corin turned, he shifted in his seat, just slightly. Enough to reposition his body and allow his foot to nudge the edge of his briefcase further under the seat, securing the encrypted drive within. The same movement caused Brillin, who had been standing a bit too close, to lose his balance slightly and catch himself awkwardly against the side of the armrest. It wasn't violent. It wasn't even forceful. But the clumsy stumble in front of a dozen watchful passengers stripped Brillin of his illusion of dominance. He straightened quickly, cheeks flushed with embarrassment that he tried to mask as irritation. "You think you can turn this into some kind of stunt?" Brillin snapped, eyes narrowing. "You think those recordings matter?" "They do," Kalen replied simply. "And they are." The quiet confidence in his voice carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. 2 rows back, a middle-aged passenger raised his phone a little higher, no longer pretending to scroll. A man across the aisle leaned forward, eyes sharp with attention. These weren't just bored travelers anymore. They were witnesses, and whether they knew it or not, they were part of the record now. Brillin's nostrils flared. He opened his mouth again, but Kalen was already moving. With fluid precision, he reached under the armrest and tapped a hidden switch. A compact evidence module, no larger than a paperback novel, slid out silently. It activated with a soft blue pulse, syncing with his smartwatch and locking the audio, video, and sensor data into a tamper-proof sequence. The blinking red dot confirmed it had begun a secondary layer of secure documentation, independent from the devices of others. Across from him, Brillin's face drained of color. What is that?" he asked, feigning composure. "A personal safety log," Kalen answered without looking up. "Legal in-flight data acquisition module. Compliant with all national transit security laws. It records everything: motion, temperature shifts, vocal tone variances, and proximity interactions. Don't worry, it'll have you in high definition." The flight attendant's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. He couldn't. Not now. Kalen had boxed him in with words and strategy so tightly that any action forward would only seal his fate. Brillin looked to the galley, as if expecting a colleague to intervene, but the co-attendant he'd whispered to earlier now busied himself elsewhere, eyes deliberately averted. The wall of support Brillin once counted on had quietly collapsed. Jaren tugged gently at his father's sleeve. "Is it over?" he whispered. Kalen leaned down, brushed his son's hair aside, and replied gently, "No, but we're exactly where we need to be." Brillin's foot tapped involuntarily, a nervous tick breaking through the cracks. He glanced at the ceiling, then the exit sign, then back to Kalen. But the man in 1A was unmovable. The world around them shifted with every passing second. Power, attention, narrative, and Brillin was no longer holding any of it. More phones came out, discreet, quiet, but clearly turned on. Kalen looked across the aisle and made brief eye contact with one of the recording passengers. The man gave a slight nod, wordlessly acknowledging the signal. Another angle secured. It was all unfolding with cinematic precision. Foreshadowing fulfilled. Preparation meeting the moment. Every contingency Kalen had thought through, every quiet safeguard put in place, now activated like gears in a well-built machine. His restraint hadn't just diffused violence. It had built a case so airtight that it was already transitioning from confrontation to prosecution. He gently closed the evidence module and folded his hands in his lap, eyes never leaving Brillin's. What seemed like chaos was already under the full control of a mind 3 steps ahead. Brillin Voss shoved the compliance form hard onto Kalen Maris's lap. The impact made a sharp snapping sound against the polished fabric of Kalen's navy suit. The entire first-class cabin tensed, head slowly turning, unsure whether to look away or bear witness. Kalen didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on the tray as if weighing the exact temperature of the act, not in anger but calculation. Jaren, seated beside him, instinctively reached out, his small fingers clutching at his father's sleeve. Without a word, Kalen gently lifted the form and placed it on the seat beside him. The ink was already smudged, the checkbox boxes hastily marked, as if Brillin had drafted the document in a fit of self-justified arrogance. The flight attendant, his lips curled in false confidence, declared loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "Refusal to sign will be noted as non-compliance. I will file this with my captain." Still seated, Kalen tilted his head, voice calm but edged with steel. "I'll respond through proper channels once we land." It was the way he said it, like a man who already knew how the ending was written, that made Brillin bristle. With a sudden burst of frustration, Brillin dropped to a crouch and reached under the seat. His fingers landed on the edge of the black briefcase. It was a miscalculation, a serious one. Kalen moved. In one fluid motion, the CEO stood, tall, centered, and utterly composed. There was no panic in his movement, only certainty. He leaned slightly toward the elderly man seated across the aisle and, with a voice of quiet authority, asked, "Would you kindly watch over my son for just a moment?" The man, wide-eyed but resolute, nodded, already reaching out his hand to guide the boy gently across the seat divide. Jaren obeyed without question. He knew that tone. It wasn't fear, it was preparation. Kalen's shoes made no sound as he stepped forward, placing himself directly between Brillin and the briefcase. "Do not touch what you don't understand," he said. His voice was low, deliberate, meant for one man, yet echoing throughout the cabin. Brillin looked up from his crouch, hand still inches from the case, now paralyzed by something unfamiliar, uncertainty. His sneer faltered. He stood slowly, perhaps expecting Kalen to raise his voice, to lash out, to give him an excuse. But there was none, only silence, and the rising hum of awareness behind every seat in the cabin. One passenger near the window raised his phone subtly, capturing the moment from an angle that hadn't been noticed before. Another, seated diagonally across from Kalen, lowered his tray table and set his phone on it with the camera angled upward, hands-free, but recording everything. Brillin opened his mouth, but no sound came. The briefcase under the seat wasn't just a bag. It was a symbol of what Brillin couldn't grasp. It contained corporate data worth billions, sure, but more than that, it was the physical boundary between power born of aggression and power born of restraint. Kalen didn't blink. He had already activated the silent legal protocol on his smartwatch the moment the form touched his lap. He had documented every motion, every word, every expression. He had 3 video feeds already uploading via satellite. And now he stood, not in defiance, but as a warning. Passengers could feel it. They leaned in, not with fear, but reverence. The drama had shifted. The predator had mistaken his target, and the hunted had become the architect of his own defense. Brillin, in contrast, had begun to sweat. A thin sheen formed near his temples, caught in the light of the overhead reading lamps. He straightened his spine as if to reassert dominance, but the effort fell flat. He smirked in a final act of mockery, gesturing to the form still on the seat. "Just following policy," he muttered. But no one nodded. No one agreed. And then, for the first time since the flight had taken off, Brillin's eyes betrayed something subtle and buried. It wasn't rage. It wasn't confidence. It was doubt. And in that doubt, Kalen saw the moment he had been waiting for. The turning point. The cabin pressure hadn't changed, but everyone could feel it. A shift in the air. The turbulence outside was nothing compared to the tremors of reckoning inside. The man he tried to humiliate had just stood up, quietly, powerfully, and with the law in his pocket. Brillin's fingers were already curling toward the zipper of the briefcase when Kalen rose, slow and deliberate, like a tide that refused to be ignored. The cabin hushed, tension knitting through the recycled air. The overhead lights cast a quiet shimmer over Kalen's navy suit, but the real gravity came from his voice, low, precise, unwavering. "You have now attempted to confiscate private property without authority. I advise you to back away." The words didn't rise in volume, but they carried something heavier than sound. Command. Brillin hesitated, startled by the composure. His hand paused mid-reach, trembled just slightly, then withdrew as if stung by a boundary he hadn't expected to exist. His lips parted, searching for footing. And then he found it, not in reason but in defiance. He turned toward the galley and pressed the intercom button. Cabin security, this is Attendant Voss requesting immediate support in the first-class cabin. We have a... He never finished the sentence. A chair scraped gently from row 3B. Not rushed, not panicked, just inevitable. A man in a charcoal gray blazer stood, adjusting his cuffs as he stepped into the aisle. He walked with calm, efficient balance. A quiet pulse began to build in the cabin. Not panic, not yet, but anticipation, as if something just shifted in the oxygen itself. He reached the center aisle and lifted a leather badge holder from his inside pocket. The golden seal shimmered under the cabin lights. My name is Torin Vey. I'm a federal compliance auditor assigned to the National Aviation Oversight Division. Brillin froze mid-breath. Passengers leaned forward. Phones, already half-raised from earlier tension, now lifted fully. Cameras were recording again. This interaction is already under observation, Torin continued, voice even but edged with finality, and has been since the aircraft left the gate. Kalen didn't move. His eyes met Torin's briefly, and in that flicker of acknowledgement, a silent understanding passed between them. Two men who had both prepared, just in different ways. Brillin stammered. You're with the airline? No, Torin said, and let the silence stretch like a verdict. I'm with Federal Transport Compliance. Your name was flagged the moment this flight was selected for routine inspection. What was not routine? He glanced toward Kalen. Was the alert triggered 10 minutes after boarding? It fast-tracked this into a live case file. A beat passed. Then another twist unraveled. More quietly. Torin tapped his earpiece, confirming receipt of audio file BRV 712. He turned back toward the growing audience of passengers. This recording includes an earlier statement made by the flight attendant to another crew member before takeoff. Quote, I don't like how he acts like he owns the sky. Gasps rippled through the cabin, soft but sharp. Brillin's face drained of color. Even the co-attendant, previously silent at the galley, took a half-step backward. Dramatic irony surged through the space. Those who had watched this unfold were now seeing it from a different lens. Brillin had believed he was holding the reins of control, weaponizing his uniform and imagined authority. But the truth had caught up, and it wasn't just Kalen who had seen it coming. It was the system itself. You're twisting this? Brillin croaked, eyes darting from Torin to the watching passengers, then to Kalen, who still stood silently, his son watching from the seat. Twisting, Torin echoed, almost gently. We have visual footage, synchronized timestamps, for audio captures, and a federal witness in cabin. I would advise you to remain silent for your own legal interest. Brillin's mouth opened again, then closed. He stepped back slowly, the same steps he had taken earlier with arrogance, now reversed with shame. Torin turned to Kalen. Sir, I understand you've remained restrained throughout. I will now conduct a formal witness sequence and collect statements. Beginning with you. Kalen gave a single nod. His son's eyes followed every motion, imprinting this moment in the quiet folds of memory. He reached for Jaren's hand and gave it a reassuring squeeze. The passengers didn't speak, but the weight of the moment was written in every stunned glance. Every phone held steady, every silent shift of posture. The predator had revealed himself, but it was the quiet preparation of the prey that had rewritten the ending. Brillin slumped into the seat nearest the galley, no longer a figure of authority but a cautionary echo of it. Torin faced the cabin, speaking once more. Federal aviation protocol is clear. Any interference with passenger dignity or property will be subject to real-time accountability. That begins now. And as silence folded around them once more, the hum of the engines barely audible over the quiet tremble in the air. One truth rang louder than anything else. The man who spit on another's dignity had just spit into the path of federal review. He smirked, confident his humiliation would go unpunished, unaware that every detail, the spit, the reaction, the witnesses, was already being captured for undeniable exposure. If you believe cruelty under authority always folds when evidence is ready, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Brillen's face shifted in an instant. His arrogance melted into panic as the weight of the moment closed in. "Look, it was just a joke," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly as he raised his hands defensively. "I didn't mean anything by it. I've been under a lot of pressure lately, just trying to keep the cabin in order. That's all." But the cabin had gone still. No one moved to support him. Not the co-attendant who had chuckled earlier at his remarks. Not the pilot over the intercom. Not the fellow crew member who had smiled during the earlier tray slam. That same co-attendant now subtly stepped aside, retreating behind the galley curtain as if the very proximity to Brillen was now a liability. Torrin Vey, the federal auditor who had just revealed himself with his badge, kept his tone level but authoritative. "Mr. Maris," he said, addressing Kalen with clarity, "I'd like you to remain calm while I conduct interviews with those in your vicinity. Your cooperation will be appreciated." Kalen gave a nod, the barest inclination of his head, before calmly returning to his seat. His posture was upright, his breathing measured, and as he sat down, he extended his arm. The elderly man across the aisle gently returned Jaren to him, and the child immediately curled close, his small hands gripping his father's sleeve. Kalen placed a hand protectively on Jaren's back, steady and warm. The encrypted drive under his seat, still untouched, remained secure. But Kalen had not yet played his final card. With one fluid motion, almost imperceptible to those not watching closely, he tapped a series of commands on his smartwatch. The face of the device glowed with a soft pulse before transitioning to a secure interface. A prompt appeared. "Activate legal action protocol?" Kalen pressed confirm. A discrete notification flashed. Incident report 227, initializing. Behind the simple label was a sophisticated legal command suite developed by Virulon Systems, designed for emergency executive use. The moment it was activated, every video, image, and audio file on Kalen's watch, along with metadata including timestamps, device angles, and cabin coordinates, was synced via satellite relay to Virulon's legal servers. The system instantly created a time-anchored, court-formatted digital file package, complete with indexed evidence folders, AI-parsed transcription logs, and even a witness proximity matrix based on Bluetooth pings from surrounding devices. What began as humiliation was now building into a legal precision strike. Brillen stood awkwardly by the service area, shifting on his feet. He knew something had shifted. The room didn't belong to him anymore. It never had. Then, quietly but firmly, a voice leaned in from the aisle beside Kalen's seat. "Excuse me," said the man in 2C, extending a business card with deliberate care. "Darnell Voss. I'm a contract litigation attorney. I've been watching everything. If you need legal counsel, I'd be proud to stand with you."
Pro bono.
Kalen studied him for a second. Darnell's face held no opportunism, only conviction. A man who had seen too many injustices let go without consequence. Kalen accepted the card with a single nod. "Appreciated," he replied softly, returning the card to the inner pocket of his blazer. He leaned back in his seat, hands still resting protectively on Jaren, while his other index finger discreetly uploaded the active witness list to Virulon's internal legal command chat. Names, seat numbers, recording angles, all archived. Already. By now, other passengers had begun syncing their own recordings to backup clouds, having seen Kalen's composed activation. A ripple effect began. Someone in row 4 whispered, "That man had a system ready before this even started." Another murmured, "That flight attendant is finished." Brillen tried to approach once more, this time with palms raised, almost begging for a do-over. "Maybe we can resolve this quietly. No need to make it bigger than it is." But Kalen turned just slightly toward him, voice low but absolute. "You made it bigger when you targeted a father in front of his son." Brillen's shoulders sagged. Torrin Vey, still monitoring the scene, made a subtle call on his encrypted line, confirming mid-flight case acquisition. Legal jurisdiction had now officially entered the skies. From behind, One of the passengers who had recorded the initial spitting incident spoke for the first time. "We got you covered, sir. Don't worry." Everyone saw. That single voice became a symbol, not of revenge, but of collective witness. And as the plane hummed along at 36,000 feet, a new kind of cabin pressure had taken hold, not one of altitude, but of consequence. The turning point was no longer Kalen's alone. It belonged to every father traveling with a child, every passenger forced into silence, and every injustice that had gone unchallenged just one flight too long. Brillen's mouth opened, but no words came, because finally he understood. He hadn't just picked the wrong man, he picked the one who already had the courtroom waiting. Brillen Voss sat rigidly near the galley, stripped of his authority, his uniform now looking more like a costume than a badge of power. The lead flight marshal, a silent man with firm posture and a stern brow, stood behind him with arms crossed. Not a word was exchanged between them. The hush in the cabin was absolute. No clink of glasses, no cough, not even a whisper. Tension had stolen the air long before the landing gear had begun its descent. Dr. Kalen Maris didn't look back. He remained composed in seat 1A, holding Jaren close with one arm while his other rested on the encrypted briefcase beneath his feet. The boy had nestled into his father's side, finally breathing with a bit more ease, though his wide eyes remained watchful. Kalen leaned down and whispered, "We're almost there. You did well. Just a little longer." Jaren gave the slightest nod. His trust in his father now deepened by a quiet display of calm strength he didn't yet fully understand. Mid-cabin, Torin Vey, the undercover federal investigator, moved methodically from seat to seat, his tone measured, his notepad discreet. "Just need your quick statement, sir. Thank you. And yours as well, ma'am. I appreciate your time." He moved with the kind of clarity that made people feel heard but not burdened. Every few minutes, he tapped something on his tablet that synced directly with the Federal Aviation Misconduct Database, assigning passenger statements to a newly forming case. Incident Report 227, the same code Kalen had triggered only an hour earlier. A young man in a hoodie 2 rows back, barely old enough to rent a car, clutched his phone like it was evidence in a trial. He had filmed the entire moment Brillen spat on Kalen, stunned into silence at the time but now feeling the weight of what his camera had captured. His hand trembled slightly as he reviewed the footage. His lips moved as if reciting lines from a testimony not yet given. The plane's descent began, jolting the cabin slightly. Kalen sat upright, one hand still on Jaren's back. His eyes scanned the cabin slowly, not out of fear, but calculation. He had always taught his boardroom to move 3 moves ahead. Now, here at 35,000 feet, justice wasn't something in theory, it was something taking shape, cell by cell, bite by bite, recorded and cross-referenced in real time. When the wheels touched down with a heavy sigh against the runway, no one applauded. It wasn't that kind of flight. The aircraft taxied slowly to a private hangar instead of the main gate. Unusual. Then came the hush-breaking sound. The front cabin door clicked open with a hydraulic groan, and the sunlight burst through in quiet judgment. 3 federal agents stood at the edge of the jetway, flanked by a transport officer and a compliance observer. Their posture was unmistakable. This was not a welcome committee. One of them, a tall man with a federal crest clipped to his belt, gave a nod toward Torin. The signal had been received. Kalen rose slowly, not with spectacle, but with deliberation. He picked up the briefcase with one hand and reached for Jaren with the other. Jaren gripped his father's fingers, standing tall despite the weight of the moment. As they stepped into the aisle, passengers leaned aside, not out of fear, but respect. Some gave quiet nods. One man mouthed, "Thank you." Another placed a hand over his heart. Then the young man in the hoodie stepped forward, his voice low but certain. "Sir, I filmed everything. The spit, the way he mocked you, the way you stayed calm. It's all here." He extended his phone like an offering. "What you did, how you stayed calm. People need to see that." His eyes were wide with a mix of reverence and disbelief, like he was standing before a living contradiction to everything he'd seen go wrong in the world. Kalen met his gaze, nodded once, and replied with quiet sincerity. Then let the truth do what it's meant to. He took the phone gently and handed it off to one of the agents behind him, who immediately sealed it into an evidence bag. As Kalen and Jaren stepped down the jetway, flashes of camera light from the outer security perimeter bounced off the metal, but none were intrusive. The media hadn't been notified yet. This wasn't about exposure. It was about setting the record. Brillin remained seated, still restrained near the galley. He hadn't spoken since the marshal ordered him there. His eyes, once sharp with derision, were now hollow with realization. He hadn't just lost control. He had handed it over, gift-wrapped, to the one man on board who understood how to weaponize silence, restraint, and evidence better than any courtroom warrior. Outside, the tarmac shimmered under the mid-afternoon sun. Kalen adjusted his grip on the briefcase. Jaren looked up, eyes no longer fearful but thoughtful. He whispered, "Is it over now?" Kalen didn't answer right away. He paused, letting the weight of the moment pass between them like a signal, a rite of passage. Then he offered a half-smile. "No," he said, "it's just beginning." Passengers continued filing out in stunned silence. Some paused to glance at the agents. Others avoided Brillin's gaze entirely. But a few turned back toward Kalen's retreating figure and watched the man who had refused to break, even when spit stained his face, walk into the sunlight without a single raised voice. The video would surface within hours. But in that quiet space between the jetway and the agents, between a child's question and a father's silent answer, justice had already taken flight. The flight had landed, but the real ascent of justice was just beginning. The moment the footage went live, it hit the internet like a lightning strike. 3 separate passengers had uploaded their videos within hours of the flight's landing, each clip capturing the same humiliating act from different angles. Brillin Voss spitting in the face of Dr. Kalen Maris, seated in 1A with his young son beside him. There was no shouting, no retaliation, just a stunned silence that hung in the air before the videos cut to Kalen's composed yet razor-sharp response. One video caught the gasp from a nearby passenger. Another showed Jaren clutching his father's hand in quiet fear. The third was the most damning. A close-up from across the aisle, capturing Brillin's smug expression in the seconds before his act, followed by the full, chilling aftermath. By morning, the views had surged past 12 million. Headlines began multiplying at a dizzying rate. News feeds, digital banners, and talk show segments all echoed one version or another of the same gripping title. Flight attendant spits on CEO with child, the calm retaliation that changed everything. The story became a lit match dropped into a room full of dry paper. On social media, parents, professionals, and aviation workers voiced their outrage. #Incident227 began trending within 6 hours. Videos were stitched with commentary. Analysts praised Kalen's restraint while condemning the airline's silence. It was no longer about one flight. It was about what that flight had revealed. Outside Arian Air's headquarters in downtown Valoris City, a crowd formed. What began as a dozen protesters with cardboard signs by noon became a sea of hundreds by dusk. Placards reading "Respect takes flight last" and "Would you spit on a white CEO?" flooded the media. The airline spokesperson issued a brief statement that evening, calling the incident a misunderstood tension during routine service. The backlash was immediate and brutal. One news anchor blinked at the camera and replied, "A child watched his father get spit on for asking for a meal. That's not a misunderstanding. That's abuse." Inside the privacy of his Virilon Systems suite, Kalen sat with Jaren beside him on the couch, watching the news scroll by. He hadn't said a word to the press. Not once. Not even when outlets begged for exclusive interviews or photo ops. He didn't need headlines, he needed justice. That night, while Jaren slept, Kalen convened with his legal chief, Von Keller, and 2 former aviation compliance officers. "The case won't just be against Brillin," Kalen said, standing before a digital display that mapped the timeline of events. His voice was calm but edged with purpose. Arian Air cultivated this, enabled it, hid it. Vaughn tapped his tablet, nodding. "We'll file dual complaints. One personal, battery, aggravated misconduct. And one systemic, hostile in-flight environment, suppression of prior reports, gross negligence. Kalen's eyes flicked to the board. Build it airtight. We do this through process, not outrage. And so it began. A digital case file titled 227 Maris was initialized. Within it, every second of footage, every passenger testimony, and every internal timestamp was organized. Cross-referenced. Verified. Kalen's security team tracked Brillen's employment history, and that's when the second fault line cracked open. Sir, Vaughn said later that week, voice tense. We found 2 internal complaints against Brillen, one in 2023 for verbal harassment, another in early 2024 for aggressive confrontation. Kalen leaned forward slowly. Dismissed. Silenced. Marked as resolved with no fault. But we traced emails between crew managers. They labeled the complainants as overreactive passengers and instructed the HR system to classify it as training misalignment. Kalen closed his eyes briefly, not in surprise, but in grim confirmation. This isn't just about me anymore, he said quietly. They thought silence would protect them. They never expected someone would come prepared to pull the whole thread. He tapped a final command into his smartwatch. Activate 227 escalation protocol. All footage. All documents. Send to our Federal Aviation Liaison. Within seconds, encrypted packets left Virilon's servers. In a dim control room of the airline's Crisis Response Center, red alerts blinked across 3 terminals. A systems manager leaned in, brows furrowed. Sir, we've just been served discovery notices. Simultaneously, legal and regulatory. Across the terminal wall, a paused image of Brillen's face filled the screen mid-motion, in the act of spitting. The room fell into silence. And beyond that silence, the world kept watching. What started as one man's humiliation became evidence of a system built on silence. The courtroom lights dimmed as the bailiff rolled in the AV cart. A monitor flickered to life, and the judge gave a single nod. Proceed, he said. The prosecutor clicked play. There was no fanfare. No introduction. Just the moment. Brillen Voss standing in the aisle of Ariane Air Flight 417, holding a tray. Then, the act, the spit, a sharp motion, brutal in its simplicity, landing squarely on Dr. Kalen Maris's face as his son sat beside him. The reaction in the courtroom was immediate. Audible gasps, hushed murmurs. One juror shifted forward, visibly shaken. Another reached instinctively for the armrest, mirroring the tension on screen. Kalen didn't flinch. Not in the footage, not now. He sat upright at the plaintiff's table, calm, hands clasped gently in front of him. The courtroom watched as the screen revealed the aftermath, his measured breathing, his subtle gesture toward the smartwatch recording it all, the way he reassured Jaren with a quiet nod. Not a single word of retaliation, not a raised voice, just precision. Witnesses could see the disparity, rage versus restraint, chaos versus control. The opposing counsel rose as the footage ended. His voice steady but his argument hollow. What we saw, he began, pacing, was a highly unfortunate interaction, yes, but it must be taken in context. Mr. Voss was fatigued. The flight was stressful. The alleged pressure placed on airline staff has been mounting in recent months. This wasn't malice, it was misjudgment. He turned toward the judge. This is not the picture of systemic abuse. It is the portrait of one man pushed too far. Kalen's attorney didn't rise. He didn't need to, not yet. The judge gestured. Dr. Maris, you may speak. Kalen stood, buttoned his coat, and stepped to the center of the room. The silence that followed was unlike the rest. It was expectant, charged. His voice, when it came, was smooth and even. My son was beside me, 10 years old, learning what dignity means, not through words but by watching. Watching how a man handles disrespect. Watching how a parent protects without violence. He looked directly at the jury. You saw the moment, but let me explain the context. I am a CEO. I lead teams across borders. I know pressure. I know fatigue. But I also know restraint. What happened on that flight was not a snap of emotion. It was an expression of belief, one Brillen Voss has carried for longer than this case. He paused, nodding toward his attorney, who opened a folder and pulled out sealed documents. Kalen stepped aside. "These are not just my words. These are records." The attorney handed them to the clerk, who distributed them across the bench and jury. HR files. 2 formal complaints from previous flights. Witness statements from colleagues who had overheard Brillen use phrases like putting entitled passengers in their place and teaching them to stay humble. Both complaints had been dismissed internally by Arian Air. That was before Incident Report 227. But the final piece, the pivot point, came next. Kalen's legal team played a second clip. This one had no visuals, just a crew room recording, time-stamped and authenticated. Brillen's voice, unmistakable, came through the speakers. "Some people think money means they're above orders. I'll show them otherwise." The weight of the words landed heavily in the courtroom. The jury's expressions shifted from curious to stunned. One juror let out a breath he'd been holding. The judge leaned back, lips pressed in a thin line. The implication was clear. Brillen hadn't snapped, he had planned. He hadn't just acted out, he had targeted. And he wasn't alone. He had been enabled by a culture that allowed it to fester. The opposing counsel scrambled to pivot. "That recording, it's from another flight. It's unrelated. You can't directly link it to the incident." But the judge held up a hand. "Counselor, enough." Kalen spoke once more softly. "What this trial isn't about is revenge. It's about recognition. That what's tolerated in silence becomes permission. That what my son witnessed should not become his expectation for how men are treated, especially men who stay calm under fire." He returned to his seat. The courtroom remained quiet for several seconds before the judge finally addressed the room. "Court will adjourn for today. The jury will reconvene tomorrow. But let the record reflect that the evidence introduced today is more than compelling." As Kalen sat beside his son and gently placed a hand over his, there was no satisfaction in his face, only clarity. The damage had already been done, but so had the preparation. What Brillen meant as a moment of domination had been transformed into undeniable exposure. Every decision Kalen made on that flight, each step of calm, each recorded frame, each withheld word, now stood as a record of power handled without aggression. The press would wait outside. The public would react. But inside the courtroom, truth didn't shout. It didn't posture. It didn't demand. It simply showed. Justice didn't raise its voice. It simply showed what had already been done. The gavel fell. A clean, final sound that echoed through the courtroom and seemed to ripple through every man seated in the gallery. Brillen Voss flinched as if the sound itself had weight. The judge's voice followed, deliberate and devoid of drama. "Mr. Voss is hereby prohibited from future employment within any capacity involving public service or commercial aviation. Furthermore, Arian Air will be fined $82 million for gross negligence, violation of passenger rights, and the failure to enforce proper disciplinary oversight in previous incidents." Kalen Maris didn't blink. He simply lowered his gaze for a moment. His hands folded calmly on the polished table in front of him. Beside him, his lead counsel, Arvin Cole, released a quiet breath, but Kalen remained unmoved. The room, filled with a heavy stillness, seemed to wait for him to react. He didn't. Not with triumph, not with relief. Because for Kalen, this wasn't the finish line. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was already gathering. News vans rolled forward, cameras mounted, hoping to capture a soundbite, a sliver of reaction, a headline born from emotion. But inside the courtroom, Kalen had already made his next move, one that none of them saw coming. The moment the hearing adjourned, he stepped out with his briefcase in hand and his son's hand in the other. He bypassed the press entirely. Instead of turning toward the cameras, he turned left, entering a quiet conference room where 3 of his former colleagues from aviation compliance waited. Derek Lang, retired flight marshal, Julian Marin, ethics attorney, and Stellan Roy, aviation systems strategist. They stood as he entered, nodding in silent respect. "It's time," Kalen said simply, placing the settlement file onto the table. Within hours, the entire disbursement, every cent from the court-awarded settlement, was rerouted into the founding charter of a new oversight body, the Passenger Dignity Board. Its mission was clear: independent investigations, legal support for passengers, mandatory quarterly audits on in-flight conduct, and a public-facing index of compliance ratings for every major airline. Kalen sat at the head of the table while the articles of formation were signed. He did not ask for his name to be listed as founder. He requested anonymity in the charter. The board, he explained, was not to serve his legacy, it was to protect those without power to build their own. But the board wasn't enough. In the following weeks, Kalen quietly worked with civil litigation advisors and airline veterans to draft a new national protocol. One that would no longer leave professional discretion unchecked behind closed cabin doors. They called it the Maris Protocol. The document was unflinching. It laid out step-by-step training requirements for every flight attendant and in-flight supervisor. De-escalation procedures, ethics-based service decision-making, immediate flag systems for crew complaints, and live auditing mechanisms via passenger-recorded footage. It was radical and, for some, controversial. But it was also airtight. He submitted it to the Federal Aviation Compliance Bureau, attaching anonymized testimony, footage, and transcripts from the Flight 417 incident, not for vengeance, but for validation. Within 60 days, the FACB not only approved it, they mandated its adoption nationwide. The protocol would become law. Still, Kalen stayed out of the limelight. At Virulon Systems, he resumed his work quietly. No press tours. No interviews. When journalists arrived at his office door, he declined politely and consistently. He told his publicist to reject all speaking fees and appearance offers. His only exception came 3 months later. It was a calm afternoon at the Civic Leadership Forum in East Valor. A large hall filled with young professionals and civic advocates. Kalen arrived without a written speech. At his side stood Jaron, a little taller now, his dark hair brushed neatly, his eyes surveying the room with a mixture of awe and understanding. Kalen approached the podium in silence. Cameras clicked. Reporters leaned in. But his voice remained even. "This wasn't about ego," he said, his hand gently resting on his son's shoulder. "It was about showing my son that restraint is not weakness. It's strength without permission." The polished tiles of Westmore International Airport gleamed under the soft morning light. But it was the plaque at Gate 17 that drew the attention of a small group gathered silently nearby. Among them stood a boy, just shy of his teenage years, his fingers curled around the steady hand of the man beside him. Jaron Maris had grown taller since that flight, but the memory of it was still anchored in his eyes. Beside him, Dr. Kalen Maris, his father, the man whose silence had once thundered louder than outrage, stood motionless. His gaze fixed not on the plaque, but on the space just beyond it, as if watching something only he could still see. The words etched into the brushed metal surface glinted faintly. The Maris Protocol was born from restraint, not revenge. May every child fly in safety, and every father stand without fear. Travelers passed by with rolling suitcases and cups of coffee, many oblivious to the weight of that inscription. But now and then someone would pause. A man in a pilot's uniform stopped mid-step. A young father with a toddler slowed, whispered something to his wife, and took a picture. A businessman glanced at the plaque, read the lines, and exhaled deeply before moving on. For those who knew, the words were not just memorial, they were a mark of transformation. Kalen remained silent. His tailored coat hung neatly, his stance composed, but his mind drifted back to the moment everything changed. Not the spitting, not the confrontation, but the choice to remain still, to let the world watch instead of lash out. That was the moment that shaped everything after. And now, as Jaron's grip tightened, Kalen finally blinked and came back to the present. "That's your name," Jaron said softly, looking up at the plaque. His voice had deepened slightly with age, but it still held wonder. Kalen gave a slow nod. "It is. But it belongs to more than just us now." Jaron turned back to the crowd, watching people pass by without knowing. Do you think they'll ever know what happened? They don't have to, Kalen said, as long as what could happen never does again. Inside Aryan Air's headquarters, now operating under completely new management, the changes were more than symbolic. The board Kalen had founded, the Passenger Dignity Board, was no longer a temporary watchdog. It had become a permanent institution. Testimonies from former Aryan staff confirmed what insiders had long whispered. The culture was broken before that flight. Employees had been trained to de-escalate in theory, but in practice, silence and hierarchy ruled. Now, that silence had been replaced by visibility. Every new hire underwent Maris protocol training, lessons rooted not in retaliation, but in integrity. In the terminals, flat screens now displayed clear passengers' rights before boarding. A dedicated complaint interface replaced the vague feedback forms that once led nowhere. And perhaps most importantly, cabin crew briefings included real footage from Flight 417, not for shame, but for education. Back in the terminal, a small boy ran up to the plaque and stopped, reading the first line aloud. "What's restraint?" he asked his father, tugging on his sleeve. The man smiled and knelt beside him. "It's when you're strong enough to act, but wise enough to wait." A subtle shift moved through Kalen's chest. He glanced down at Jaren, who caught the moment and grinned. "You waited," Jaren whispered. "I did," Kalen said. "And sometimes that's how you win." Just beyond the gate glass, a new Aryan Air jet taxied into place, its wing glinting under the rising sun. The cabin crew inside had no idea who was standing a few feet away at the terminal window, and that was how Kalen preferred it. Quiet progress, measured change. Let others take credit. Let systems reform. Let dignity rise quietly and do its work. A maintenance worker walked by, paused, and saluted casually toward the plaque. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. And so the two stood there, father and son, side by side, witnessing not just memory, but legacy. The world hadn't ended in a courtroom or an apology. It had evolved because one man refused to match hate with heat. He had instead matched it with truth, patience, and proof. Brillen's name had been erased from public records, scrubbed after legal counsel and privacy laws. His case now a cautionary tale studied behind closed doors. But Kalen's presence remained, not in headlines, but in every pre-flight safety slide, in every crew manual footnote, in the quiet codes murmured between gate agents. Incident 227. A number now synonymous with silent resistance and clear-eyed consequence. Passengers continued walking. Some slowed, others didn't. But the story endured, etched not only in steel, but in the air around it. Some men fight with fury. Others win by standing still and making sure the whole world sees what was done. He froze as the footage from 3 phones went viral, showing the CEO's calm retaliation and holding the crew accountable instantly. If you believe true authority turns aggression into proof and consequences, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights prejudice, abuse of authority, and the power of composure and strategic action in confronting wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and respect for every passenger.